Good afternoon, pilot teachers, and good afternoon, students. Okay, thank you. Sit down. We will quickly look at the homework that you were supposed to have done, and that was basically looking at the plate margins or plate boundaries we looked at yesterday. The plate boundaries or margins were that of constructive margins, destructive, and passive or conservative margins. For your homework, you were only supposed to look at the constructive and destructive margins and explain briefly in your own words why you think those different margins are referred to as constructive, and when plates diverge, sorry, I'll repeat that, when plates diverge, why is it that we call the boundaries constructive, and when plates converge, why is it that we call the boundaries a destructive margin? And that's what you're supposed to have done for your homework. Frank, your answer for the first one, that homework that is, why do you think we call an area where plates diverge, the margin is a constructive margin?
It is called a constructive plate boundary because the tectonic plates diverge, which allows magma to the surface, constructing a ridge or forming a ridge here.
Okay, good. In other words, we are looking at the construction of the land rather than the destruction. When magma reaches the surface, it forms a ridge. We can see land being created there. So therefore, that boundary is referred to as a constructive boundary, and that is when plates diverge. Let's look at when plates converge. Why do we call the boundary or the margin a destructive plate boundary or destructive plate margin? Moses? No? Noel? Okay, Noel is going to give us the answer for why he thinks when plates converge, the margin, why is it that the margin is referred to as a destructive plate margin or boundary?
It is called destructive because when plates converge, there are a lot of activities happening. The ocean or land underwater form underwater trenches, fall mountains on the land.
Okay, so very good. If we're looking at the reason for why it's called destructive, because there is a lot of destruction which is actually done to the area in which the plates are converging. So if you look at on the ocean floor bed, the trenches are formed, subduction occurs. On the surface or on the land, especially continental landmass, we see the buckling of the Earth's crust, resulting in fall mountains. Also, along oceanic crust, we're looking at formation of volcanic arcs. Volcanoes are formed, magma rises to the surface. Here you can see destruction which is actually done to the land. Therefore, the margin is referred to as a destructive plate boundary or margin. Okay, good. Today, we are going to move on now to looking at, we're still looking at plate tectonics, and we're going to look at where plates converge, especially when we're looking at oceanic plates, where two oceanic plates converge or an oceanic plate meeting a continental plate, and we're going to look at the process of subduction. If we can make reference now to the information from our booklet on page 7, we're going to look at a good example of subduction occurring, and as a result of that also, other features that are formed when plates converge or collide or when plates come together. And the example that we're going to look at will be subduction occurring where the Pacific plate meeting up with the South American plate, and the formation of the mountains, the fold mountains that is, of the coast of South America, which are the Andes. So in other words, we are basically looking at some of the features that are formed as a result of when plates converge, and from the information from our booklet and the activity which I will assign, you will also be able to look at how those different features are created when plates converge or move towards each other. We already note that when plates diverge, ridges are formed, volcanoes are formed, earthquakes can be felt. When plates slide past each other, transform faults are formed. Volcanoes also are common, earthquakes are felt. Similarly, when plates converge, features like volcanoes are formed, subduction occurs, fold mountains, form trenches are formed, and etc. So today basically we will look at converging of a plate, or two plates that is, and the formation of the Andes of South America, how that came about as a result of the movement of plates or convergence of plates. Okay, the information we will look at now from our booklet first, and then we'll go to the information from the monitor. From our booklet on page 7, it tells us that the three diagrams that you can see on page 7, which is labeled figure 10, shows how the Andes of South America were formed. And the Andes of South America are fold mountains. That is, when layers of sedimentary rocks were compressed as the plate that forms the Pacific Basin collided with the South American continent. Note that the Pacific plate is being forced under, and the forcing of the South Pacific plate under is referred to as subduction. In other words, subduction is simply a process whereby a weaker plate is actually forced under another plate. And it is usually a weaker plate which is forced under, resulting in a process of subduction. As the plate is actually subducted or pushed further into the mantle, it will eventually be melted and become part of it. Meanwhile, where the boundary is, subduction is occurring on the continental plate. Fold mountains are actually formed, and that is an example of how subduction occurs off the coast of the Pacific, and on the continental plate, a fold mountain is actually created. So if we look at the three diagrams that are given, you note those three diagrams, you will be constructing those three diagrams, and in your construction, you will also be explaining the stages and the processes in which it has helped or aided in the formation of the fold mountains, which are referred to as the Andes. Let's go back to what we have covered, and we'll make reference to the information from our monitor now. And from the monitor, you would have noted here that where plates converge or come together, a trench is actually formed. But note the subduction in the formation of the trench. Here you have two oceanic plates, and the example we are looking at here is that of the Tongan Trench. So this will have to be in the Pacific Ocean, or where the Pacific plate is. It tells us there that the Tongan Trench is a destructive plate margin involving two oceanic plates. And the margin is actually characterized by a deep trench and an arc of volcanic islands formed by melting within and above descending plates. So here we are looking at an example of subduction actually occurring, but here subduction of two oceanic plates. So we have an oceanic crust meeting another oceanic crust, and note the weaker one subducting, resulting in the formation of a trench. And because this is to do with two oceanic crusts, you also have the volcanic arcs being formed. The volcanic arcs are simply islands which are volcanic, a line of volcanic islands giving us the volcanic arcs. To do with what we are going to be constructing, the formation of the Andes, we now have an example again showing us the Peru-Chile Trench. And the Peru-Chile Trench is actually in a destructive margin simply because we have the converging of plates. Whenever plates converge, the margin or the boundary is a destructive plate boundary. And here we have the trench being formed as a result of the Pacific plate meeting with the South American plate. Subduction occurs where the oceanic plate moves under the North American plate, which is a continental plate. The oceanic plate forms a trench as it is carried down. So as subduction occurs, the Peru-Chilean Trench is actually formed. Note, the lighter continental material rises into forming the mountain ranges. So meanwhile, the buckling of the surface of the earth on the continental crust, that is, will result then in the formation of the mountains. And for the case of this example, it is the Andes that we are looking at. So this diagram will show us the processes that are leading to the formation of the Andes, and at the same time, subduction occurring, resulting in the formation of the Peru-Chile Trench. Any questions with regards to those two features which are formed as a result of the movement? Converging, that is. Okay, if there are no questions, what I would like you to actually do now is I'd like you to construct into your exercise book the different stages in the development of the Andes of South America, which is a fold mountain and which is also a feature that is formed as a result of converging of plates. So if we look at our textbook and the information presented on the monitor, initial folding and volcanism, you see the oceanic plate, which is the Pacific plate that is moving towards the South American plate. Where they meet, you can see a trench being formed and you can see the process of subduction occurring. Meanwhile, notice the land area here on the continental plate, which is the South American plate. Second stage, note now the buckling, and you can now see the beginning of the mountain ranges being formed on the South American continent. Meanwhile, continuous converging of plates in that area. You can see the subduction, actually the materials here getting further down into the mantle, and you can also still be able to identify the trench, where the trench is. Note here the volcanic arcs now starting to develop. Again, this will not take within days or 3 or 4 days or a month or a week or so. It will take millions of years, depending on the rate at which the plates are moving. On the third and the final stage now, we have the trench itself being well developed, the Chilean-Peru trench, which is here. We already note the process of subduction still continuing, volcanic islands being formed, and the fold mountains here on the continental plates forming the Andes of South America. If we refer to our booklet, those 3 diagrams are also showing us information in stages. The only thing about those diagrams is that they have no explanation to go with the different stages. So your task now is, into your exercise book, I would like you to construct those 3 diagrams. Note that those 3 diagrams are also in 3 dimensions. And when you are constructing for each of the stage, I'd like you also to explain what you can see from that particular diagram. So it will go with your diagram, what you can see from the diagram, as it shows the stages in the development of the fold mountains, which are the Andes of South America. So I'd like you to work on that now and see if you can get your constructions into your exercise book. Okay, I'd like to make a reference to the readings, and this should be able to also help you with your explanation for some of you who are already starting. Beside the construction of the 3 diagrams, you're supposed to write a little bit also to explain each of those diagrams, as those diagrams are showing us the stages in the development of the Andes. Okay, let's make reference now to the worksheet that is given, and then we can have this work completed, maybe for your homework if it is not completed. So I'd like us to look at the information from the worksheet. If you look at the information from the worksheet, it talks about ocean-continent convergence. So if you look at the diagram and also the information on the formation of the Andes, it is mainly to do with an oceanic plate converging with a continental plate. When a plate capped by oceanic crust is subducted under a continental plate, and actionary wedge and forearc basin would usually form an active continental margin between the trench and the continent. So if you're looking at those terms that we have just referred to, when an oceanic crust meets up with a continental crust, this is the continental crust, the oceanic crust, like in the case of the diagrams you are constructing also, a trench is actually formed. And note also an actionary wedge, which is this place here as shown in the black color. And forearc basin, this is the basin here before you come to the continental land. They form an active continental margin between the trench and the continent. You can also refer to the diagram from your worksheet or handout to note the area we are talking about. It also goes on to say, a Benioff zone of earthquake dips under the edge of the continent. So we are looking at this particular zone here, the subduction zone, of which the Benioff zone is also marked along this area. And note that it will actually be formed under the continent. So if this process of subduction continues, you would have noted that this particular zone should be directly under the continents, the edge of the continents that is. And this particular zone, the definition given here, is simply to do with a seismic zone where the earthquake focus is actually shallow, near the base of the ocean trench. And as it gets deeper, the activity intensifies. So it is mainly to do with a seismic zone or an earthquake zone. The Benioff zone again marks the edge. It usually marks the edge of 2 plate margins where one is overridden by another during the process of subduction. And that's what this zone is actually referring to. So 2 things to remember about the zone. It is a seismic zone, and it is also a zone where it marks the edge of 2 plate margins where one is overridden by another during the process of subduction. It goes on to say that Benioff zone of earthquake which dips under the edge of the continent, which is marked by andesitic volcanism and a young mountain belt. So if you look at the diagram here and also in your or on your worksheet, you will see the mountain belt, and from that mountain belt you will note the volcanic arcs, and you also note the young or edge of the mountain ranges, or the young fold mountain belt that is. So here you have andesitic volcanoes being formed where the mountain belt is, as well as that the young fold mountain belt which are also formed. And it tells us that an example of this type of boundary is the subduction of the Nazca plate or the Pacific plate under the western South American plate, resulting in the formation of the Andes. The information goes on to read that the magma that is created by the oceanic continent convergence, it forms what we call a magmatic arc. And if you look at your diagram, that is figure 19.33, or the diagram on the board here, the magmatic arc refers to this group of mountains here. And magmatic arc is a broad term which is used both for island arcs, of which we've covered island arcs already, features which are formed as a result of plates converging at sea, and for belts of igneous activities on the edge of continents. The surface expression of a magmatic arc is either a line of andesitic islands, such as the Olentian Islands, or a line of andesitic continental volcanoes, such as the Cascade volcanoes of the Pacific Northwest. And beneath the volcanoes are large plutons in thickened crust, and we see those plutons, or we see these plutons as batholith on land when they're exposed by deep erosion. We will look at plutonic activities, and we will look at batholith when we cover volcanism. And that's another topic which we will look at after the work on plate tectonics. The rest of the information from the handout you can actually read for your homework. I would like you also, for your homework, to ensure that your diagrams that you have been asked to construct are completed, and as well as that you write a little bit of explanation to go together with each of those 3 stages in the development of the Andes. That will bring us to the end of our lesson. Before we conclude, or I conclude the lesson, does anyone have any questions with regards to what we have covered today on subduction and formation of fold mountains? No questions? Okay, class, if you can now stand up. To our pilot teachers, the key word for lesson 26 is subduction. Good afternoon, and thank you, students.